Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Claire McDonald, and it's with great pleasure that I welcome you today to the fifth webinar in the Governing for Reform webinar series entitled Transforming for an Inclusive Future, Why, How, Who? Today we'll be discussing the important issue of inclusion and diversity within aged care. Specifically, we'll be exploring the role of the governing body and executive leaders in driving change and setting the example for inclusive service provision. This webinar is the first in a two-part series. So the second webinar in this series will happen in early October and will focus on cultural safety for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders. Today, though, we'll be drawing on the incredible insights and stories from our panel members with the intention of elevating some of the practical examples of what boards and leaders are doing to advance their inclusion and diversity agendas within aged care in Australia and more broadly. Before we get started, I'm conscious that while many of you are joining us today have been participating in the program for some time, others may be quite new to the program and wondering what it's all about. So if you're here for the first time, welcome to the program. If you head to the Governing for Reform in Aged Care website, as a registered program participant, you'll have access to a huge range of learning modules, including a couple of modules that I think we sent prior to this event today, which are the culturally safe governance module and the consumers at the centre of care module. So there's a whole heap of other ones there for you to have a look at and work through. You'll also find recordings from all of the previous webinars and information about opportunities to get in other parts of the program on that website. So if you head there to have a look, there's all sorts of things for you to look at. Another thing we're really excited to share is that our first podcast episodes have now been recorded and will soon be ready for you to listen to. The series is called Conversations to Transform Aged Care, and it includes episodes with Marie McCabe, Professor Joanna Westbrook, and Rachel Argaman, and they cover a range of topics like dementia care, the use of data, and the aged care workforce. You'll be able to access all the episodes of the podcast on the Governing for Reform website from September, so keep an eye out for those. One last thing before we dive into our panel conversation today, can I just draw your attention to the layout of your screen? You'll notice that you can manipulate the windows on the screen in any way you like. So if you like to see faces, you can make that window bigger, or if you'd like to see the slides, you can make that window bigger. So just have a little fiddle around with that and set it up to your preference. There's also a little box on the screen where you can type questions. So if you're having trouble with your screen, somebody will be able to give you some tech assistance with that box. But also, if you have any questions throughout the session, you can submit questions there, and we're going to leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer a few of those questions. So we won't get to all of them, but as time allows, we'll be able to answer a few questions from audience members. So that's the little box where you submit questions. Before we get into it, I'd like to just pause and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're all calling in from today, which is lots of different traditional lands. I'm on Gadigal country this afternoon. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all those lands. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging who have looked after those lands for many thousands of years. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're all sharing this home now together and working towards a shared future, caring for the land together. I'd also really love to welcome any Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people who are joining us in the audience today and on the call today. So what we're going to do now is introduce the panel. So as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about inclusion and diversity within aged care today. So we've got some wonderful panellists that are joining me to have a discussion that I'm sure you'll find really, really interesting. a wealth of experience we're bringing to this conversation today. I feel quite privileged to be able to be part of it. First of all, I'd like to welcome Tracy Burton, who is the Executive Director of Uniting New South Wales and ACT. She's been in that role since 2018. Tracy's got more than 30 years of experience in the Australian health and community services sector, including in many leadership roles. In addition, Tracy's also served as a board director for aged care services, disability services in New Zealand, and for a medical research foundation. So welcome, Tracy. Thanks for being with us today. Next up, we have Ljubica Petrov. Ljubica has extensive experience in working with organisations that aspire to be recognised as leaders in inclusive service provision. Her work includes consultancy and training aimed at anchoring inclusive service initiatives to organisational strategies, policies and service delivery. For over 25 years, Ljubica has managed the Centre for Cultural Diversity in Ageing. Currently, Ljubica works as a consultant specialising in the development and design of quality services for elderly people from special needs groups. So welcome, Ljubica. Thanks for being with us today. And Liz Forsyth is our final panel member, who is APM's Chief Executive for Disability and Aged Care. Up until last year, Liz was KPMG's Global Industry Lead for Infrastructure, Government and Healthcare, along with being the Global Sector Head for Government. She also led KPMG's Human and Social Services practice globally for 6 years. While part of KPMG Australia, Liz was also the Deputy Chair for 6 years and is currently a board member for Bridge Housing. Liz is also a social worker by background and has worked directly for governments at both the state and national level. So a very, very, very warm welcome to all of our panellists. I think they're going to join me on the screen now. Hello. I was worried that you weren't going to pop up there for a second. I thought I was going to be by myself. So a little side note is that I'm actually in the Uniting offices this morning, and I thought very appropriately I'm in a meeting room called Compassion. So while I'm talking to you today, I am looking at Compassion written on the wall, which I think is so appropriate and lovely. So thank you, Tracy, for hosting me this morning, as well as being my guest. It's a bit funny, isn't it? Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to kick off with Ljubica. So Ljubica, you've got a wealth of experience in this space. You've had extensive kind of experience working with organisations to kind of help organisations be recognised as inclusive service providers. So what is it that you think is so important about this issue for aged care, and what is it that you're seeing in the aged care sector that is emerging as the most important thing for the diversity and inclusion sort of agenda for organisations?
Thank you, Mary Claire. I'd like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and I too acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we all come from today, and pay my respects to elders nationally. What I have observed over my long career with the aged care sector is that diversity originally, when I started working, was seen in aged care as a lifestyle consideration. It was something that was part of Standard 8, and it was the lifestyle coordinators that took the lead in addressing diversity. So, they took the lead in organising celebrations. In very rare occasions, they did book interpreters to have a conversation with people who spoke languages other than English. And that was kind of where it sat. Fortunately, over the years, there have been many organisations or aged care providers that have recognised that diversity is more about the whole of the person, and it needs to be considered in the vein of person-centeredness, and ensuring that every person receives quality care. When speaking about diversity, we're not just speaking about people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds anymore. We are speaking about the 9 groups that are listed in the Aged Care Act as groups that have been identified to be facing barriers in accessing services as well as accessing quality services. So the big change has been in that organizations are now saying that diversity needs to be addressed more broadly, that intersectionality needs to be addressed, and that it needs to be addressed across all of the aged care standards.
Thanks, Libitza. Now, I'm interested, Tracy, to hear your view on this, because what I'm hearing from Libitza is that while it's very important to be addressing diversity and inclusion on the ground, there's also a very essential role for leaders to be playing in this agenda and shaping sort of the discussion and the systems that are in place to be able to support that work. So I know that you've got some views on that as a chief executive. So I'd love to hear about, firstly, what your views are on the role of the leader in shaping that agenda. And secondly, what you've been doing at Uniting in this space with your leadership team, including the board.
Thanks, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people who are part of the Eora Nation, and it's a privilege to be here and have this discussion today. Yes, the research shows that if you're to be successful in creating inclusion, and it is the inclusion piece that matters. Diversity is a reality. We are an incredibly diverse community, so it's about inclusion. And inclusion is so important because, from my mind, it's actually a precursor. It's an essential element in order for someone to feel safe and to thrive. So the inclusive piece is what we're after here. And the role of the leader in that is very, very multifaceted. It's actually about, the research shows that you have to have a strategy, a robust strategy that is then sort of brought to life through systems and policies. It has to be leader-led. There have to be accountabilities. So that's the only way to sort of shift and drive to that culture that is going to assure the respect, the inclusiveness that will create that safe place for someone to thrive. So making sure that you have a strategy, have an intent, and then bringing it to life. So every occasion that you can take to talk about the importance of inclusion, to be accountable about measuring against your KPIs, infusing it into everything you do. So Uniting, we're really on a journey of sort of trying to stop it from being sort of an add-on and a specific strategy to just being inherent in everything we do. Just like quality, just like safety, inclusiveness is really something that we're after. So everybody at every level needs to play their role. And I think if it's set against a robust strategy, that's one of the key leadership elements, is to make sure it's a priority and that it is a strategy that aligns with the organisation's broader strategy.
Beautiful, thank you. Now, Liz, can we skip over to you for a second, because I'd love to hear your perspective on this more broadly. So I know that you're very familiar with aged care, but I think sometimes it's really helpful to be able to bring the conversation, zoom the conversation out a bit and sort of think about what other industries are doing in this space. And I'd love to hear what you've been exposed to in your other roles outside of aged care in this space.
Mary Claire, I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the traditional owners, and thank them for the opportunity for this meeting to be held on their lands. I think with the recent push around ESG and a focus on, particularly as a consequence of the pandemic, about the broader impact we all have on the world that we live in today, issues of diversity and inclusion are starting to come to the fore, as are others around good governance and around environmental matters. And what we're seeing, I think, around the globe at the moment is refocusing on this, not just because it's good practice, but it's because it's good business sense. And we're starting to see the notion of diversity, as Tracy's very clearly articulated, shift to the focus of inclusion and allowing very much an individualised focus around the person, and whether that's person-centred care in aged care, or it's person-centred approaches in disability or human services, or it's focusing on the unique requirements of the individual, starting to come into play and challenge, I think, being presented to our traditional ways of operating. And so whether it's in the workplace through hybrid working arrangements, whether it's in the way that we see careers and career progression, whether it's in the way that we start to think about tailoring services around an individual, we're seeing an increased focus on the person, their unique situation, their unique network of supports as fundamental to the forward directions in government policy around human services, but also starting to play out in the business world, because we're looking for positive net benefit to be provided, and being able to recognise that diversity in our workforce and bringing new players into the decision making and the problem solving arrangements allows us, I think, to get different views. Nothing's simple these days. It's very complicated. So the more diversity of opinion, the more able we are to bring different thoughts and different ways of thinking into play, the more likely it is we're going to find a way forward that actually meets the needs of many rather than the needs of a few. In aged care and in human services, this is no more true than in most contemporary services today. And the reason for this is we're seeing some quite significant challenge to traditional program structures and a recognition that traditional ways of working are not necessarily delivering the outcomes and the impacts that we're looking for. And we need to rethink what that looks like on the ground. And so picking up on the two panelists' views early on, if you want to create excellence in customer service and you want to create great outcomes and impacts for individuals, you have to place the person at the centre. You have to understand their unique situation, and you have to respond to those aspirations. And that, by definition, means that you have to accommodate diversity, and you have to understand it, and you have to bend and shape the way that you deliver services to make your practice and your ways of working inclusive, so people feel engaged and able to participate, which in turn can lead to better outcomes for all.
Thanks, Liz. Tracy, I might come back to you for a moment, because what I'd love to sort of unpick a little bit is this idea of inclusion being part of everybody's job description, and how at Uniting you are sort of inspiring and enabling your staff to be able to deliver services in new ways that are more inclusive, and giving them sort of the license to be able to do that while you're still leading the organisational position on that, and creating structures to support them. So I think that's a very warbled question, but what I'm asking about is the personal responsibility that you're giving to staff in providing services inclusively.
Yeah, thank you. And I loved how Liz described that, actually, about bending and shaping practices to actually respond to the unique needs and characteristics of the individuals that we're there to serve. And, you know, I think with that responsibility that we are trying to have the work, that the reform or the shaping is best done very close to where the actual person being served is. So we can't just give that responsibility to our people without also giving them support. So at Uniting, as part of that strategy that I mentioned, we have very sort of deliberate training packages. We have, deliberate conversations around programs to address at all levels. I mean, one that comes to mind is our building confident communicators in our aged care homes. So a situation often can arise where we've got someone from a non-English speaking background, for example, caring for someone with a classic Australian Anglo-Saxon background, and the racism piece is coming to light, and the staff member is lacking confidence to actually how to communicate. So we developed a really intentional program to actually allow our staff to build their confidence. And part of it was quite beautiful, really, because it ended up with residents pairing up with people with English as a second language in a program of helping them, build their English skills. It had real life scenarios where staff had experienced different things and was giving them tools. So we can't just ask our staff to be doing this work at the front line, close to the people we're here to serve, without giving them lots of support. But it does then sort of go back all the way through the roles that each of us have. So our senior leaders, our executive team, our board, making sure that we are making this an issue that we're talking about a lot. What gets talked about by leaders matters. What gets measured matters. And so I think you can only be successful if you're doing this work at every single level. But we can't just ask our frontline people to do this without direct support.
Thanks, Tracy. Lubitsa, could you talk to us a little bit about your view on diversity in workforce? Because I know that in preparation for this webinar, we've had a little bit of a chat about what that looks like and what impacts that can have on the overall diversity and inclusion agenda for an organisation. So I'm really interested to understand your thoughts on the importance of diversity in the workforce and the strengths that can bring.
There is a twofold consideration in relation to workforce. One is where organisations need to think about who their elderly population is, or the service users are, and the languages that they speak, and if possible, endeavour to employ staff who will match the language of the residents, so that meaningful conversations can be had more accessibly than accessing language services. There is also a wealth of cultural knowledge that those people would bring with them. And the second consideration is what Tracy has just mentioned, is where growing number of staff who work in aged care services are from non-English speaking background, and quite often in organisations where that is not acknowledged, or the commitment to making their organisations inclusive is not evident, those staff are often looked upon not in a favourable way. There's almost an apologetic situation that happens where a resident might be requesting someone who is of Anglo-Australian background, and they might be upset because they have a carer who is coming in who is from a more newly arrived community. And quite often providers don't know how to deal with that. Tracy has mentioned some strategies, and one of the main ones is where the organisation needs to stand behind those workers who are experiencing possible discrimination within the service, and demonstrate their pride in them being great workers and workers that can address the consumer's needs, rather than being apologetic in some unfortunate circumstances that I have seen around that issue.
Wonderful. So, Tracy, can I just bounce back to you? Because I know that you've got some other examples of work that you've been doing. And specifically what I want to sort of dig into is working in a space where you're unsure of what's going to be successful, and responding to failures, or responding to things that might not pan out exactly as you had planned. So I think in this space there is some reluctance to act for fear that you'll get it wrong. And I know that you've got a little bit of experience in that. And I was hoping that you'd share some of those stories with us in the spirit of a little bit of vulnerability. So, yeah, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about that. So one example that we had recently where we have taken on a performance-based contract, which we believe in sort of an outcomes-based approach. So we bravely sort of took on a new model of contracting. And this is where the role of the board, it can be so important. We were quite, as an executive and as the managers responsible for this particular program, we were like, oh, we've missed our targets. That means we've lost X thousands of dollars. And when we took this to the board and we said, this is the outcomes after the first year, one of our board members very quickly said, well, we wouldn't not have done it, would we? Even though we've lost money on it, significant money on it. We've wanted to learn. We want to get in this space. We want this to work. So, the instant reaction that a leader can have, at the board level, at any level about a failure is really important. And I remember when I first joined Uniting, or not long after I joined Uniting, I was sitting at an event where we were presenting back the outcomes of a wonderful project that Uniting had received some innovation funding to do. It's called Mosaic, and it was about creating an app that would really help carers and family members talk with a resident and understand and know the resident's needs if they were from an LGBTIQ background. And it was a wonderful app, and we had it independently assessed by one of the universities. And I was sitting where my team were presenting to the broader world in terms of here's the outcomes from this work that we've been doing. And they shared a lot of failures in that, and I was sort of thinking, oh my goodness, we're doing our dirty laundry here. But of course, that's transparency, that's leadership, that's making sure that somebody else doesn't make the same mistakes. So I think it does take courage, and fortunately, our program, our approach to diversity and inclusion is embedded in our values. So as you said, you're sitting in a room that's called compassion. So our values are compassion, respect, imaginative, and bold. And the D&I space really does require the bold, calling things out and taking risks. And it takes the imaginative as well. That's the innovation, the creativity. And of course, from that, you've got to accept that you won't get things right all the time. So I guess the best thing is to recognize that there will be failures. You'll head down a path and it doesn't work. So failing fast and moving on, I think is key. So hopefully that's helpful.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Now, Liz, could you give us a little bit of insight into what you think, what you've been hearing in boardrooms, the kinds of conversations that you think have been helpful in pushing more inclusive ways of operating in organisations, and the kinds of, so first of all, the kinds of conversations that are helpful, and secondly, the kinds of questions that boards should be asking of their executive teams in this space.
I might even go to a slightly different issue but related and come to those in a moment. I think one of the things that we've got to do is that the diversity conversation has been around for quite some time, and there is a tendency for experienced directors to feel that they've been there, done that, and they've got it. And I think it really underplays the structural nature of some of the barriers varying groups experience in the way that our society works. And one of the things that I think has been most powerful, and certainly a fair bit of work was done on this in recent times, is around the concept of unconscious bias. And it does allow that sort of really fundamental understanding of how people experience systems and the world that is different to come into light, as well as flag our working assumptions that at times actually create the barriers to inclusive behaviour. And so any reading that the board can do or training around unconscious bias, I think, is quite critical in terms of creating a baseline understanding that this remains a contemporary issue and an issue still to be solved, because it's not as simple as getting the numbers right. It's really about understanding that the way we work, the means by which we work, is as important as the outcomes that are delivered. So that, I think, is really fundamental. The second part, I think, of my response to the two questions that you've asked is really about bringing the client into the centre of board consideration. It's very easy to get tied up in a balanced scorecard or a set of KPIs. They are important, but hearing the voice of the client and making sure that we have a breadth of responses, we're not looking for a synthesis, we're looking to hear people's experience, because we understand increasingly so that experience is to some extent as important as outcomes, because if the experience is positive, it actually can lead you to have a better view about what's been able to be delivered. And bring that diversity of view into play is really very important. So mechanisms for client feedback and keeping the board abreast of the types of issues clients want to talk about, their concerns, their successes, issues of importance to them, becomes, I think, really important at a board level. And I think that qualitative input is as important as the quantitative. The third thing that I would say is that we've got to find ways to keep this on the board's agenda. It is core business. It is what leads to excellence in service and great outcomes. And we need to find a way to make this a standing item, and a standing item in a way that is colourful, that gives people a sense of actually what's happening on the ground. And whether it's a project or whether it's the recognition of a particular period of time of the year, maybe Ramadan or whatever it may be, or it's something else, we've got to continually bring this back to the boards and our executive as areas of focus, so that we don't get caught in the rut of doing the business the same way every day, because it's not about that. It's actually about recognising that difference is valuable, and it brings value not only to the way that you deliver services, but in terms of the way that people experience it. And it moves it from mundane to joyous. And that's how people thrive and flourish. So they're the sorts of things that we're starting to see, but a leveller at the beginning in terms of an unconscious bias assessment, I think, is really powerful, because it then flags everybody is responsible for this issue and everybody needs to keep learning.
I can't tell you how much I love some of those ideas, Liz. The idea of moving towards flourishing is a beautiful idea, and I particularly love that idea in the context of board conversations. I think that is would be music to many board members' ears, I think. So, Lubitsa, can we go back to you for a second? Because I know that you're very passionate about the idea of flourishing, and about the idea that diversity and inclusion are huge strengths to an organisation and can bring all sorts of positive outcomes. What is it that you think organisations can focus on that give them the biggest impact in terms of the experience of their people? And when I say their people, I mean people working in the organisations and also consumers.
I think one of the most important things that needs to occur is to hear the voices of the people who are in the aged care service, as well as the staff who are there. The boards, sorry, I've just lost the train of thought.
That's all right. So what do you think makes the biggest sort of impact? So what can organisations be doing that will really draw out these strengths in a diverse and inclusive way of operating?
Thank you. The foremost on board's agenda should be ensuring that diversity is something that is addressed in all the strategies, in all of the aspects of the service development, in the design of service, in the recruitment of staff, in policies, etc. Diversity can no longer be kind of just looked at as was stated earlier, as an afterthought, as something, we've designed the most amazing service and we have some diversity among our consumers, so what do? It needs to be at the forefront of the initial design if it's going to be successful.
Now, you've talked to me too about a whole heap of resources that organisations, aged care organisations can access. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of those, because I know a lot of the audience members are interested in sort of practical things that they can get their hands on to help them to do this work. I know there's a lot of enthusiasm, but not a lot of time. And we're trying to kind of figure out how we can make baby steps and integrate things as we go. So I know that you had some ideas on that, Ljubica.
One of the most important aspects that has been raised by everyone is to hear the consumers' voices. And in order to ensure that you are able to communicate effectively with consumers, there is access to language services. In the past, it used to be just access to interpreters at the time of assessment. However, now there's also access, organisations can have access to translate their services. Government also funds a number of initiatives such as the Partners in Culturally Appropriate Care, PICAC, that has been in existence for a long time, where organisations in each state and territory can access training in the area of diversity. And there are other organisations for each of the special needs groups as well. The department has also developed diversity frameworks for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, LGBTI community, and for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And those are accompanied by action plans which can guide organisations in pursuing practice that is inclusive for those communities. There are numerous websites that are very useful, especially the Centre for Cultural Diversity in Ageing website that does include a whole section on an inclusive approach, as is stated in the Inclusive Service Standards, which are also referenced in the Aged Care Quality Commission's aged care standards. So, there are numerous resources which providers can avail themselves of, as well as pursue their own training that happens, and requesting that whatever training happens within their service, there's an element to it that addresses diversity. So if you have training that's addressing dementia or quality clinical care, ask those trainers to also give you strategies on how to ensure that what they are saying can be done in an inclusive way.
Yeah, beautiful. So I'm hearing that conversations are really important, both from you and Liz, and that just incorporating these kinds of ideas into conversations about other things is really important and can be very powerful. Welcome back, Tracy. I think we lost you for a split second there, but here you are. You're back again. So I was wondering, Tracy, if you could give us a little bit of just switching gears a little bit, give us a little bit of an idea of how you, your executive team engages with the board and the kinds of conversations that you're having about the sort of system changes that you're putting in place and the strategy that you're putting in place around the diversity and inclusion agenda.
Thanks, Mary Claire. Yeah, I guess it's the board is keen to make sure that we are systematizing this. So storytelling is really important, and hearing the voice, exactly what's been expressed there by Liz as well is so important. And sorry, just a plug back for the Centre for Diversity and Ageing in terms of resources. There's a fantastic podcast that a couple of my team members have done recently that'll be released in a couple of weeks. So we'll make sure that the link to that is provided at the end. I think tapping into the wisdom of others and others' resources is just so important, and the storytelling piece. So, yeah, so our board wants to, well, we have set key performance indicators that result from the strategy. And so every year we would do a sort of comprehensive report to the board in terms of how have we shifted along in that strategy, and we've got some key measures there. And then they're wanting to make sure that we have the cascading of that. How does this actually become reality? And so our sort of governance structure for D&I is multi-level, and the executive team play a key role in it. We have a diversity and inclusion council, which brings together the leadership of our 4 networks. So we're really driving the work through 4 networks. One is LGBTIQ, one is our Aboriginal workforce as a network, one is our people with a disability, and the final one is COLD. And so because intersectionality, as was called out earlier, is of increasing importance, those 4 pillars sort of come together at that level. So one of the key roles of the board is to actually see how is the system actually rolling this down. They need to see the outcomes in terms of the KPIs, but they need to see that it's not just a hit and hope effort. It is actually been systematised and incorporated into everything that we do.
Thanks, Tracy. I've got, you know how I said that we could take some questions? I've got a question that's popped up that I think relates to this conversation. So I know we said for the last 10 or 15 minutes, but I'm going to pop it in now because I think it's really interesting to address in that context. So the question is, so this is from an audience member. My board has recognised that they lack diversity. It's a very Anglo-Saxon board. We have talked about recruiting for greater diversity, but are there better other ways of bringing diversity into the boardroom, e.g. voice of consumer / worker, etc.? I would be interested in views on this. How do you take that step to build greater diversity on the board, and what does that really look like? So, Liz, can we go to you? Because I think that this is really tied up in your idea of unconscious bias, and if we've got a board that is not very diverse, what challenges can that throw up? So could we go to you first, but I'd be interested to hear all of your views on that question, because I think that it's really an interesting consideration, isn't it?
I think this is quite a complex issue, and I think the fact that it's been identified is really positive, but it does raise questions at your board level. So, you know, common thinking at the moment about boards is that they need to be skills-based, and in being skills-based, they need to traverse a wide range of competencies to bring capability to the way that the organisation works. You could similarly argue, if you want to create an inclusive service delivery response, you also need to bring in a competency matrix around inclusion as well into the mix of the board. So it's not just simply about skills and competencies, it's also about diversity of approach, experience, and opinion. And there is opportunity, I think, for boards to recalibrate and heighten their focus from a skills and capability perspective to bring diversity into the mix of the people that they need to have on their boards to guide their organisations going forward. And I think that's particularly true when one looks at the clients that you're trying to support and service. And as we've discussed, I think about the criticality of being able to see oneself in the workforce, we also need to be able to see oneself in the executive, and we need to be able to see oneself in the board. And so I think there is merit in reconfiguring to establish that as a more structural solution. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing, though, is I think there are a lot of really practical things that you can do within your organisation if you're awaiting vacancies or, an opportunity to strengthen that diversity at the board level, that can be really quite powerful. And you need to bring that into the structures for your appointment of people at a managerial level, as well as a frontline service delivery level. But you also then need to bring in processes that help with that. And some of those processes are about, I think, really flexing up your policies and your procedures to remove the unnecessary bias that sits within them. We have particular ways of working that are drawn from good evidence, but also history. And some of the history is actually born from a particular style or a particular approach that maybe in 2022 is no longer relevant. And we need to check those policies and procedures with the people we're trying to serve. So the process of co-design, I think, can be really powerful, and it creates a mechanism for reflection about what's working for your diverse client base that can give you permission to think differently and create more inclusive practice. So that's something that I would be very consciously trying to do on a regular but irregular basis, a cycle of review to bring in different ways of thinking, co-design with the people you're trying to serve to create that diversity of viewpoint to ultimately take you to the point of inclusion. So that's something. And then, as we've said before, the voice of the individual. We just can't underestimate its potency, the ability to talk about one's experience in a constructive manner, to give insights about what could be better and how it could change is very powerful. And I'm confident that many people, when they have a chance to hear that presented, take away a message about what could be done better. And then the question is how you bring that into play. So diversity at the board is really important. It's important that all decision-making levels represent an inclusive way of working. We need to have the right people there, and people need to be able to see themselves in the board, in the executive, and in the frontline workforce to feel safe, but also to ensure that the service delivery meets their expectations.
Thanks, Liz. Tracy, I'll kick to you now. So how is your board connecting in, and if you know, and I'm aware that you may not know the answer to this question, how are they challenging any biases that they might have, and do you see evidence of that in their requests of you or their questions of you? Do you see that sort of process playing out?
Yes, I do, and I think Liz has offered some really practical ideas there about what to do for this period before you get to your board reflecting diversity, because it does take time. You do need to have your vacancies, etc., but it does take intentionality as well. So the chair of our board, Heather Watson, has been very intentional to progress diversity on our board. And I can't tell you how much of a difference it is actually making. If I just take one example, we've had a young Aboriginal woman join our board about 2 years ago now. Crystal Kinsella is her name. And she's not just helping us be better and more inclusive in the Aboriginal space, but her focus on calling out our unconscious biases, on demanding that we actually get our training in that space, is really clear. So I can't tell you how important it is. Exactly what Liz has just said there. People need to be able to see themselves in your board, but you can't have every group representative. Or some people, for example, someone with a disability may not actually want that to be known, or they could be LGBTQ and it's similar. So you don't always know, but that effort to sort of try and make sure that you've got as much diversity in your board, in your executive leadership team, and then using some of those mechanisms that Liz has called out there as a substitute to make sure that you're getting it right. So I just would really encourage everyone to be intentional about it, accept that it does take time, but it's very much worth pursuing. And often what you'll find, as we have with Crystal, is that they don't just bring a representation of a particular group, they bring all sorts of other skills. So Crystal, for example, is excellent in community services space. She's just dynamic and adds so much value in so many other ways as well. So it's definitely a goal that you shouldn't compromise on.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tracy. Now, Lubitsa, I just want to hook into something that Liz mentioned, and I thought you might be able to contribute a little bit further, and that is around the issue of just really making sure that your processes are being challenged and interrogated and reviewed and making sure that they're up to speed. I know with some smaller organisations that can be a real trick because they're very pressed in terms of their capacity to be able to do those kinds of reviews. Have you, as a consultant going in and helping organisations, have you seen any effective ways of addressing that challenge of sort of trying to find some time to be able to review policies and procedures amongst all of the other stuff that we're trying to get done, which is service our consumers, I guess, which is on the forefront of everybody's minds?
I think there are many resources that can help both large and small providers go through the journey of self-analysis to work out where they are on the trajectory of being inclusive for their consumers. As I will mention it now for the third time, there are many templates on the Centre for Cultural Diversity and Ageing website, which providers can use, and those are freely available. Inclusive standards do take providers through the steps that need to be considered at board level, and I really liked the complexity that was of addressing diversity at the board level that Liz described, and the practicalities of the kinds of initiatives that Tracy has mentioned that Uniting has undertaken. I would like to just stress that for boards that are considering going down the path of ensuring that they are inclusive, it's the competency and the skills that the board needs that need to be developed in relation to this journey. I think, as Tracy has mentioned, the challenge of having every group represented is something that will never happen. But what can happen is that each board member can be taken through the training, ensure that there's commitment to addressing diversity, and there are ample resources there for providers, be they small or large, to address this.
Thanks, Lubitsa. Now, I've got one other question that I'd like to just pose, and Liz, I might start with you on this one. It's a follow-on from the other question. Our organisation is a multi-service provider with aged care, one of the services. How do you ensure that the board is cognisant of all the requirements of delivering aged care when there is so much more on the agenda, for example, child protection, NDIS, and others?
This takes me back to when I was a consultant. There is what we call a lot of reciprocity between the service standards and the service expectations. So my strong advice is to map the standards and the expectations for each of those areas. And I think you'll find that about 80% of what's expected is common rather than different. And so if you can train in the core, you'll pick up the majority. And then obviously you have to be specific about the areas of variation. That flows, I think, into your KPIs and then your reporting to the board. It is a big task these days for people to sit on boards of multifaceted human services. And the expectations on board members are only but growing. Particularly as a consequence of all the commissions of inquiries. So it's mission critical that you've got a high caliber board that can take on these responsibilities. And that's where the skills matrix becomes, I think, really quite critical because of the diversity of capability that's needed from legal to financial to community services and health, necessary to guide the organisation. But I think the organisation can do something in terms of analysing expectations in terms of standards and regulatory requirements in each of those domains, because I think you'll find the wording might be slightly different, but there's a lot of commonality rather than difference, and the difference is at the edges. It's not to say it's not important, but it's more common than it's different. And if you've got the right skills mix and the right metrics, that can give you a degree of comfort in being able to meet your regulatory obligations, as well as the obligations that come with wanting to provide very high quality services that are effective.
Thanks, Liz. Tracy, I might just kick over to you, because there was another question that was sort of tied into what Liz was just mentioning, and it was about the skills mix and ensuring that you've got the skills that you need, but also that, you know, all these different considerations. So, how does your board deal with that? How do they navigate that? And I think you answered a little bit in talking about some of the members of the board that you have, but are there any other sort of comments that you'd make on that?
Yes, so the ability to have board members wear multiple hats is really important. Because we do have a relatively large board, so that does help in terms of the skills mix and the coverage as well. And then we have recently evolved our governance model, recognising what the questioner was calling out in terms of how can a single board actually be across so much. So without taking away from the overall responsibility of the whole board, every board member has to be accountable for Uniting's performance. We have actually created some dedicated committees that really focus on seniors and aged care. And so there's a number of committee members who just that's their focus. And then we have another one for communities, because all those child protection issues, disability, all of those things, they do have their differences. So just the sheer amount of time that board members have to engage with all of the information that we provide, we have evolved our structure to try and say, well, instead of just looking at critical incidents right across Uniting, we don't do that anymore. We say, let's look at critical incidents inside ageing. And then we say, let's look at critical incidents inside disability. So we're just allowing the services to be understood in their silos, if you like, rather than trying to see it as one big amorphous Uniting. And that's been an evolution for us that we've only just put in place in the last 12 months or so, and we'll be evaluating that and see how that goes. But it is a big demand on all of our board members. And as I said, it doesn't mean that someone who's not on the communities committee doesn't have to know about child protection requirements, etc. They do, and we have a process, and I'd be happy to share it actually, of listing all of the regulatory training that our board members need to do in the different areas every year. So we do have systems and processes, but it's just about how board members spend their time. And we found by creating some concentration areas, I think it's really going to lift the contribution that the board can make in that governance role.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Tracy. Now, we're fast running out of time, but one thing I will flag is that we had a question on whether, Tracy, you would be prepared to share the training packages that you referred to. And there's been some scrambling in the background with your people, and yes, Tracy has very kindly said that they can share those. So for anyone who would like to get their hands on that material, we can sort of be the middle people for that interaction. So thank you so much, Tracy, and for your people in the background that have been making that happen, answering questions for us as we go. So that's wonderful news. Thank you. But I think it's time to wrap up for today. So I'd just like to thank you all very much for joining me today. The conversation has been colourful, I think, and really useful for people who are working in the sector. And I really love the practical sort of examples that you've brought to the conversation. And as I've been blown away by in working in this sector, the willingness to share is just wonderful. So I thank you for that, and sharing your views and also your actual stuff, Tracy. So many thanks. So thank you very much to my panel members for joining me, Lubitsa, Liz and Tracy. I hope to see you again in the not too distant future. And I'm sure if there were a button where we could hear rampaging applause, that would be happening right now. Thank you very, very much for your contributions today. Now, a couple of little things to finish us off. Directly after today's event, you'll be getting an email with a link to provide some feedback. Now, it's really valuable for us to hear your feedback. So we are trying to make adjustments to the process as we go. So if you have any feedback, please do get that back to us. It would be very, very much appreciated. Another reminder, if you haven't yet completed the diagnostic tool, get into that. It's pretty easy. It doesn't take very long, and it can be really, really helpful, both in terms of navigating the content in the Governing for Reform website, which is immense. So it can sort of point you to things that are going to be most valuable for you. And I think the process of going through the diagnostic too is thought-provoking, so it can be really helpful in that way as well.